The words came out of Dante Marchetti's mouth so calmly that Clara Bennett almost missed how dangerous they were. She was standing 3 steps away from his booth, holding a tray of water glasses, and he was leaning toward his cousin Nico, with his voice low and even, speaking in the old language of his grandparents, the language most people in this restaurant assumed nobody under the age of 70 could understand anymore. He said that the woman asking questions about the shipment routes needed to be dealt with before the weekend. He said that the way another man might mention rescheduling a dinner reservation, without any anger in his voice at all, and that flatness frightened Clara more than shouting ever could have. She kept walking, she kept smiling, she set the water glasses down at table 6, and refilled 2 coffee cups at table 9, and the entire time her heart pounded so hard she was sure someone would notice, though nobody did, because nobody in this restaurant expected the new hostess to understand a single word of Sicilian. Clara had taken this job 11 days earlier because her cousin Angela worked in the kitchen and said the tips were excellent, and the owner mostly stayed upstairs in his office, out of sight, out of mind. Nobody had mentioned that the owner was Dante Marchetti, a name that made grown men in this neighborhood lower their voices when they said it. Nobody had mentioned that his restaurant, warm and busy and full of families eating pasta on a Tuesday evening, became something else entirely after the doors locked at 11. She had grown up 2 towns over, raised partly by a grandmother who refused to let the old language die, who spoke it at the kitchen table every single evening, so that Clara would carry it forward the way her own mother never had. Clara hadn't expected to ever use that language again. She certainly hadn't expected to use it here, hidden inside her like something she wasn't allowed to admit she owned, working for a man who ran half the docks on this side of the river. Dante Marchetti was 34 years old, tall, broad through the shoulders, always dressed in dark, perfectly fitted suits. He rarely smiled, and when his eyes moved across a room, they seemed to catalog everything in it, deciding what belonged and what didn't. For 11 days, Clara had been furniture to him, a hostess, someone who existed at the edge of his attention and nowhere closer. That distance ended the moment her tray tilted. It happened 3 nights after she first heard him mention the woman who needed to disappear. Clara was carrying a tray of wine glasses past his booth when Nico said something about the woman again, something about how she'd been seen speaking with a man connected to the Russo family, rivals who had been circling Marchetti territory for months, the way sharks circle a boat that's taking on water. Dante answered in Sicilian, his jaw tightening. "Find her," he said, "before she talks to anyone else." Clara's hands shook. 1 glass slid an inch across the tray before she caught it, and the small clatter of crystal against crystal was enough to make Dante glance up. "You all right?" he asked her, in English, his voice as unreadable as always. "Fine," Clara said. "Sorry." His gaze held hers half a second longer than the moment required. Then he looked back to Nico, back to his own language, back to the business of finding a woman who apparently knew something dangerous. Clara set the tray down in the kitchen and gripped the edge of the steel counter until the shaking stopped. She thought seriously about quitting that night. She thought about walking straight out the back door and never coming back, finding work at the hospital gift shop or the bank downtown, somewhere with fluorescent lighting and nothing more dangerous than an unhappy customer. But she needed this job. Her mother's medical bills had eaten through what little savings Clara had left 2 months earlier, and hostessing here paid nearly double what she'd made waiting tables at the diner on 5th Street, because everyone in this neighborhood understood, without ever saying it directly, that working for Dante Marchetti came with a kind of risk most jobs didn't carry, and risk had a price attached to it. So she went back out to the host stand. She smiled at the next family walking through the door. She told herself she hadn't understood anything at all, and if she stayed quiet and careful and useful, nobody would ever learn what she actually knew. She almost believed that. For 3 more days, she almost believed it completely. Then, on a slow Tuesday evening, with rain streaking the front windows, the restaurant emptied out early, and Clara found herself alone behind the host stand when Dante came out of his office with his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking Sicilian again, faster this time, sharper, and Clara understood immediately that whatever he was hearing was not good news. They hadn't found the woman. Not at her apartment, not at her sister's place either. Someone had warned her, someone inside the operation, And Dante wanted to know exactly who, and his voice had lost its usual quiet control completely, sharpening into something Clara had never heard from him before. He ended the call and looked up, and his eyes found Clara standing frozen behind the host stand with a stack of menus pressed against her chest. "You're still here," he said, switching back to English. "Closing duties," Clara managed. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He studied her for a long moment, the same careful, cataloging look he gave everything in his restaurant. Clara made herself hold his gaze, because looking away would have looked exactly like guilt, and as far as Dante Marchetti needed to know, she had heard nothing, understood nothing, and had absolutely no reason to be afraid of him. "Go home," he said finally. "It's late." She gathered her coat and left through the back entrance, and she told herself, walking through the rain to her car, that whatever was happening with the missing woman had nothing to do with her at all. She was wrong about that, though it would take another 8 days for her to understand exactly how wrong. On the 9th day, a man walked into the restaurant during the lunch shift, sat down alone at the bar, and ordered black coffee. He was pleasant-looking, mid-30s, with an easy, friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and something about the careful way he studied the room told Clara immediately that he wasn't an ordinary customer. He waited until she came near the bar to refill the sugar dispensers before he spoke, and when he did, he spoke in Sicilian, his voice pitched low enough that no one else could hear. He asked her whether she'd like to make some real money for once. He said it lightly, as though offering her a job at a boutique down the street, but his eyes stayed fixed on her face the entire time, watching for the smallest flicker of understanding. Clara felt her whole body go cold. She understood immediately that this wasn't really a question. It was a test, and someone had told this man that the pretty new hostess at Marchetti's understood the old language, and now he was here to find out if it was true. She had exactly 1 second to decide who she was going to be. She smiled the same blank, polite smile she gave every customer, and answered him in English. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Would you like a table, or are you comfortable at the bar?" His eyes narrowed slightly, the way a man's eyes narrow when a lie almost lands, but doesn't quite convince him completely. He ordered nothing else, paid in cash, and left within 10 minutes. And Clara spent the rest of her shift certain she had survived something she didn't fully understand, and certain that this kind of survival never lasted long. She didn't know, refilling water glasses at table 12 20 minutes later, that 2 booths away, Dante Marchetti had been watching the entire exchange over the rim of his coffee cup, and Dante Marchetti had not missed the half-second of recognition that crossed her face before she answered the stranger in English. He had built an entire career on noticing exactly that kind of half-second, the flicker a person shows right before they manage to hide something. He said nothing to her that afternoon. He let her finish her shift and walk out into the evening as though nothing unusual had happened, and then he sat alone in his office, long after the restaurant closed, turning the moment over and over in his mind, deciding what it meant, and what, if anything, he was going to do about it. Clara went home that night unaware that she had just become the single most interesting person in Dante Marchetti's entire world. She spent the evening the way she spent most evenings, sitting at her small kitchen table, with a stack of medical bills spread out in front of her, trying to figure out how many more months it would take before her mother's treatment was fully paid off. The restaurant job had been a lifeline, and Clara had promised herself, taking it, that she would keep her head down, do her work well, and never let herself get pulled into whatever happened in the rooms she wasn't invited into. That promise felt harder to keep with every passing day. She thought about the woman the Russo family had turned, the one Dante's men had been searching for, and she wondered, with a chill she couldn't quite shake, whether that woman had once made the exact same promise to herself, and whether it had been enough to save her. It hadn't been, as far as Clara could tell. Nobody at the restaurant mentioned her by name, but the tension around Dante had only grown sharper over the past week, and Nico had started arriving earlier and leaving later, and twice now, Clara had noticed unfamiliar men sitting near the front windows during slow afternoon hours, watching the street rather than eating. Something was building. Clara could feel it the way you feel weather changing, before the clouds actually arrive, a pressure in the air that made even routine tasks feel charged with meaning. She refilled sugar dispensers and reset table settings, and greeted families walking in for dinner, and underneath all of it, she kept turning the stranger's question over in her mind. Would you like to make some real money for once? She hadn't answered him honestly. She wondered, lying awake that night, whether that had been the right choice, or whether she had simply postponed a conversation that was always going to happen eventually, one way or another. The next morning, Clara arrived for her shift 10 minutes early, the way she always did, and found Nico waiting for her by the back entrance, instead of in the kitchen, where he usually spent his mornings going over deliveries with the chef. His expression was unreadable, careful in a way that made Clara's stomach tighten before he even spoke. "Boss wants to see you," Nico said, "before you clock in." Clara's mouth went dry. "Did I do something wrong?" "Just go up," Nico said, not unkindly, though he didn't answer her question either, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how serious this was. She climbed the narrow staircase behind the kitchen slowly, her hand trailing along the railing, running through every possible explanation for why Dante Marchetti would want to speak with her directly, alone, before the restaurant even opened for the day. None of the explanations she came up with made her feel any better. The office door was open when she reached the top of the stairs, and Dante was sitting behind his desk, a cup of espresso in front of him, untouched. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Close the door," Dante said finally, in English. Clara stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her, her hand lingering on the handle a beat longer than necessary, as though some instinctive part of her wanted an escape route memorized before whatever came next. Dante leaned back in his chair, studying her the way he'd studied her twice before, except now there was nothing casual left in his expression at all. "Yesterday," he said, "a man sat at my bar and spoke to you in Sicilian. You told him you didn't understand him." Clara's heart climbed into her throat. "That's right." "I don't think that's true," Dante said quietly. "I think you understood every single word he said. I think you've understood every word spoken in that language in this restaurant since your very first day, and I think you've been extremely careful to make sure nobody noticed." The silence that followed felt endless. Clara thought, for one desperate moment, about denying it again, about insisting she'd never studied the language in her life. But something in Dante's face told her the lie wouldn't survive contact with him, that he had already decided the truth was true, and was only waiting to see whether she had the courage to admit it herself. So, with her hands trembling slightly at her sides, Clara Bennett told Dante Marchetti the truth for the very first time. "My grandmother spoke it at home," she said. "I grew up with it. I didn't mention it here because I didn't think it was anyone's business, and because I needed this job more than I needed to explain myself to anyone." She paused, then made herself finish the thought completely, because there was no version of this conversation where a partial truth would be enough. "And because I heard what you said to Nico, about the woman, almost 2 weeks ago, I understood that too." Dante went very still, his expression unreadable in a way that frightened Clara more than any visible anger would have. For a long, unbearable moment, he said nothing at all, and Clara stood in the low morning light of his office, waiting to find out whether telling him the truth had just been the bravest decision of her life, or the very last mistake she would ever make. Outside, the ordinary sounds of the city continued exactly as they always did. Delivery trucks rumbling past, a dog barking somewhere down the block, completely indifferent to the fact that inside this small upstairs office, everything in Clara Bennett's carefully guarded life was about to change. Dante rose from behind his desk slowly, walked to the window, and stood there with his back to her for what felt like an eternity, his hands clasped behind him, his shoulders tense beneath the fabric of his dark suit jacket. When he finally turned back around to face her, something in his expression had shifted, the careful control replaced by something closer to curiosity, and maybe, though Clara couldn't be entirely sure yet, something closer to respect as well. "Do you know how many people work for me?" he asked her quietly. "Who could tell me exactly what's being said in every meeting I hold, in the language I use specifically because I believe it keeps certain conversations private?" "None," Clara said. "None," Dante agreed. "Not one person. My own soldiers don't speak it fluently anymore. My lawyers definitely don't. Nico understands maybe half of what I say to him, and he pretends the other half doesn't matter." He studied her again, more carefully this time, as though seeing her for the first time as something other than a hostess standing at the edge of his world. And here you are, hiding in plain sight for 2 weeks, understanding every word, saying nothing. I was scared, Clara admitted. I still am. You should be, Dante said, not unkindly. Most people who end up this close to what I do would be foolish not to be scared. He walked back toward his desk, but didn't sit down, resting one hand against the edge of it instead, studying her. The question now is what I do about you. Clara felt her pulse pounding in her throat. What are my options? A faint, almost imperceptible flicker of something crossed Dante's face, something that might have been the beginning of a smile if it had been allowed to fully form. That, he said, is an excellent question. Give me until tomorrow to decide the answer. He dismissed her without another word, and Clara walked back down the narrow staircase on legs that didn't feel entirely steady, her mind racing through every possible outcome of the conversation she'd just survived, none of them offering her any real comfort. She finished her shift that day the way she always did, greeting families, refilling water glasses, setting tables for the evening rush, but everything felt different now, sharper somehow, as though the ordinary rhythm of the restaurant was simply a thin surface stretched over something far more dangerous underneath, something Clara had just admitted, out loud, that she could see clearly. That night, lying awake in her small apartment with her mother's medical bills still spread across the kitchen table, Clara thought about the missing woman again, the one Dante's men had been searching for since before Clara had even started this job. She wondered what that woman had understood, and what she had said, and whether she had been given the same choice Clara now seemed to be facing. She wondered too, staring up at her bedroom ceiling in the darkness, why some small, reckless part of her wasn't more afraid of the answer Dante Marchetti might give her tomorrow. She should have been terrified. Instead, buried somewhere beneath the fear, she felt something closer to anticipation, a feeling she didn't fully understand yet, and wasn't entirely sure she wanted to examine too closely. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, an answer that would change the direction of Clara Bennett's entire life, though she couldn't have known that yet, lying alone in the dark, listening to the rain finally taper off outside her window, wondering what kind of man Dante Marchetti truly was underneath the careful, controlled surface he showed to everyone around him. A black car was parked outside Clara's apartment building when she left for work the next morning, and her stomach dropped the instant she saw it, certain that Dante had already made his decision and sent someone to deliver news she wasn't ready to hear. The driver, a quiet, older man named Salvo, simply rolled down his window and told her Mr. Marchetti wanted to speak with her before her shift began, and would she mind riding with him instead of taking her own car today. Clara agreed, mostly because refusing felt like it would take more courage than she had available to her at 7 in the morning, and climbed into the back seat with her hands folded tightly in her lap the entire drive. Dante was waiting in his office again, though this time he had 2 cups of coffee on the desk instead of 1, and he pushed the second one toward her as she sat down across from him, a small gesture that surprised her more than it probably should have. "I've thought about what to do with you," he said, without any preamble at all. "I have an offer. You don't have to accept it, and if you refuse, nothing changes. You keep your job at the front of the restaurant, and we forget this conversation ever happened." "And if I accept?" Clara asked. "Then everything changes," Dante said simply. "You'd stop being a hostess. You'd start sitting in on certain conversations, the ones conducted in the language you understand, translating documents my lawyers won't touch, and telling me the truth about what people say when they think I can't fully understand them myself, because there are dialects even I don't catch cleanly." Clara stared at him. "You want me working directly for you, in your world?" "I want you working directly for me," Dante confirmed, "which means you'd be seen as mine, in every sense that matters in this business. People will treat you differently. Some will respect that. Others will see it as a way to get to me through you." He paused, watching her carefully. "That's the part I need you to understand fully before you decide anything. The danger doesn't disappear because you're useful. If anything, it grows." Clara thought about the man at the bar, and the flat, careless way he'd asked whether she wanted to make real money. She thought about the missing woman, still unaccounted for after weeks of searching. She thought about her mother's medical bills sitting on her kitchen table, and the number that never seemed to shrink, no matter how many extra shifts she picked up. "What does it pay?" she asked, and something in Dante's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise, maybe even approval, at the practicality of the question. He named a figure that made Clara's breath catch, nearly triple what she made now, and she understood immediately that within a year, maybe less, her mother's debt would be completely cleared. "I'll do it," she said, before she could talk herself out of it. Dante studied her for a long moment, as though giving her one final chance to reconsider. When she didn't, he nodded once, businesslike, and reached across the desk to shake her hand, his grip firm and warm, and entirely too steady for a decision that felt, to Clara, like stepping off a ledge without knowing how far down the ground actually was. "Welcome to a much more complicated job," he said, and for the first time since she'd met him, something close to a real smile touched the corner of his mouth. The weeks that followed reshaped Clara's understanding of the world she'd unknowingly walked into 11 days before that first overheard conversation. She learned the rhythms of Dante's operation, the way she'd once learned Sicilian at her grandmother's kitchen table, slowly, carefully, absorbing far more than she ever let show on her face. She learned that Nico, for all his rough edges, was fiercely protective of Dante, having grown up alongside him since childhood, practically a brother rather than a cousin. She learned that Dante's older sister, a sharp, composed woman named Teresa, managed the financial side of the business with a precision that made even the trained accountants nervous, and that Teresa had taken an immediate, watchful interest in Clara, the way an older sister watches a new addition to the family with equal parts curiosity and caution. She learned, too, the story behind Dante's careful, guarded nature, pieced together slowly from things Teresa mentioned, and things Nico let slip, and things Dante himself eventually chose to share. 17 years earlier, Dante's father had been killed outside a restaurant much like this one, the case left unsolved, the details buried under years of silence that everyone in the neighborhood understood, but nobody discussed openly. Dante had inherited the business at 17 years old, far too young, forced to grow into a role that had hardened him long before Clara ever walked through his restaurant's front doors. The missing woman, Clara discovered during her second week in her new position, had never been found, and this unsettled Dante more than his calm exterior ever revealed. "A person who disappears on her own terms is far more dangerous," Teresa explained one afternoon, "than a person who simply vanishes because someone else made her vanish." The woman knew things about the shipment routes, about certain arrangements Dante preferred to keep quiet, and the Russo family, patient and calculating, seemed content to wait for the perfect moment to use whatever she knew against him. Clara found herself pulled steadily deeper into a world she had once promised herself she would only ever observe from its safest edges. One week, she translated a shipping contract riddled with intentionally confusing language, designed to hide certain arrangements from anyone outside the family. The next, she sat quietly in the corner of a tense meeting with a Russo lieutenant, present but silent, always aware of Dante's eyes finding hers across the room in moments of pressure, as though checking, without ever saying so directly, that she was still safe, still steady, still exactly where he could see her. It was during one such meeting, 5 weeks into her new role, that the fragile balance of everything shifted completely. The Russo lieutenant, a heavy-set man named Costa, with an easy, practiced smile and cologne strong enough to fill the entire room, made a comment near the end of the discussion, low and quick, delivered in Sicilian, clearly assuming that Clara, seated quietly in her corner chair, understood nothing beyond simple English pleasantries. He said, smiling the whole time, that everyone across the city already knew Dante Marchetti had found himself a clever new pet, one who understood the old language, and that pets, unlike loyal soldiers raised inside the family, could always be encouraged to change their loyalties with the right kind of leash. Clara felt the blood drain from her face before she could stop the reaction, and this time there was no tray of glasses to blame for it. Dante saw it happen instantly. Costa saw it too, and his easy, careless smile sharpened into something colder, more satisfied, the expression of a man who has just confirmed a rumor and is already calculating exactly how to use it to his advantage. The meeting ended shortly afterward, tense and unresolved in a way that left the whole room feeling like the air had been pulled too tight. The moment the door closed behind Costa and his men, Dante turned to face Clara directly, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something in his expression that looked unmistakably like fear. "They know," he said quietly, in English, his voice low and controlled, despite the tension visible in every line of his body. "They know you understand them, Clara. That makes you a target now, not because of anything you've done wrong, but because of what you represent. A way into my world that nobody else has ever had." "So what happens now?" Clara asked, keeping her voice steadier than the frightened pounding of her own heart. Dante was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed somewhere past her, working through calculations Clara couldn't follow. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped into something careful and deliberate, the tone of a man making a decision he already understood would change everything that came after it. "Now," he said, "I make sure nobody gets anywhere near you without going through me first." That night, after the restaurant closed and the last of the staff had gone home, Dante insisted on driving Clara back to her apartment himself, rather than sending Salvo the way he usually did. The car ride was quiet, filled with a tension that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with something neither of them had said out loud yet. "You didn't have to take this job," Dante said eventually, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I offered it, because you were useful to me. I never expected to feel responsible for keeping you safe the way I do now." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Clara said quietly. Dante glanced sideways at her, something unreadable passing across his face in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "It's complicated," he said. "Everything about caring for someone in my world is complicated." "I'm not asking for simple," Clara said. "I'm asking you to be honest with me about how dangerous this actually is." "It's very dangerous," Dante said, without hesitation. "Costa doesn't make idle comments. If he called you a pet in that meeting, it's because he's already decided you're worth pursuing, one way or another. He'll try to reach you, Clara. I need you to understand that clearly." Clara felt a chill settle over her, but underneath the fear, something steadier had begun to take root as well, a quiet determination she hadn't expected to find in herself. "Then we'll be ready for him," she said. "Together." Dante didn't answer right away. He pulled the car up outside her apartment building and sat there for a moment with the engine idling, studying her in the dim light with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Together," he repeated finally, testing the word as though it were unfamiliar to him, something he hadn't allowed himself to consider in a very long time. "I haven't done anything together with anyone since my father died. I'm not entirely sure I remember how." "Then we'll figure it out as we go," Clara said, and reached over to squeeze his hand briefly, before stepping out of the car, leaving him sitting there in the quiet, watching her walk safely to her front door, before he finally pulled away. Clara didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed replaying Costa's words in her mind, the easy, careless way he had called her a pet, as though her entire existence had been reduced to a single useful trick. She thought about the missing woman again, the one nobody spoke of by name, and wondered whether Costa had once smiled at her the same way before deciding she was worth pursuing too. In the morning, she found Teresa waiting for her in the small office at the back of the restaurant, 2 cups of tea already poured, an unusual softness in her expression that Clara hadn't seen from her before. "Nico told me what Costa said," Teresa began, sliding 1 cup across the desk. "I wanted you to hear the rest of it from me, before you hear a distorted version from someone else." "The rest of what?" Clara asked. "The history," Teresa said. "You know our father was killed. You don't know that the man responsible was never identified, and that for years, my brother has suspected the Russo family had something to do with it, without ever having proof solid enough to act on. Costa's interest in you isn't only about the shipment routes, Clara. I think it's about making sure that proof never surfaces." Clara felt the weight of that settle over her slowly. "You think I might already know something that could prove it?" "I think you might learn something eventually, simply by being close enough to my brother," Teresa said. "And I think Costa understands that possibility far better than you do right now." She studied Clara carefully over the rim of her own cup. "I need to know you understand what you agreed to. This isn't only about translating contracts anymore. I understand, Clara said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it completely. Teresa nodded slowly, satisfied, though something in her expression suggested she was still deciding exactly how much to trust the woman her brother had brought into their world. Good, she said. Then let's make sure you're prepared for whatever comes next. Over the following days, Teresa began teaching Clara things the ordinary job description had never covered. Small practical lessons delivered in quiet, unhurried moments between shifts. How to notice when someone was following her car in the rearview mirror. How to vary her route home so no pattern could be predicted. How to recognize the particular stillness, in a room that meant danger, was closer than it appeared on the surface. Clara absorbed all of it, the way she absorbed everything, carefully, without complaint, driven by a growing understanding that her safety now depended on more than simply staying quiet and useful. She had crossed a line the moment she answered that stranger in Sicilian, instead of pretending not to understand him, and there was no walking it back now, only moving forward, as prepared as she could possibly make herself. Dante noticed the change in her, almost immediately, the new alertness in the way she carried herself, the careful attention she paid to exits and entrances that hadn't been there before. He said nothing about it directly, but Clara caught him watching her sometimes across the restaurant floor, an expression on his face that mixed guilt and something warmer in equal measure, as though he couldn't decide whether he regretted pulling her into this world, or was grateful, despite everything, that she hadn't run from it. One evening, closing up after a long shift, Dante found her in the small back office, reviewing a shipment contract, riddled with deliberately confusing language, and he leaned against the doorframe, watching her work for a long moment, before she noticed him there. "You've gotten good at this," he said, "faster than anyone I've brought in before." "I had a good teacher," Clara said, not looking up from the document. "Your sister doesn't waste time explaining things twice." "She likes you," Dante said, and something in his voice suggested this, surprised him more than he expected it to. "Teresa doesn't like many people. She trusts even fewer." Clara finally looked up, meeting his eyes across the small office. "And you?" she asked. "Do you trust me yet?" Dante crossed the room slowly and sat down in the chair across from her, close enough now that she could see the tired lines around his eyes, evidence of a man who hadn't slept easily in longer than he probably wanted to admit. "I trust you more than I've trusted anyone outside my own family in a very long time," he said quietly. "Which frightens me more than Costa does, if I'm being honest with you." "Why does that frighten you?" Clara asked. "Because everyone I've ever cared about in this life," Dante said, "has eventually become a target because of it. My father, my mother. Before she passed from grief no doctor could ever properly explain. I don't know how to want something without also fearing what wanting it will cost me." Clara reached across the desk and covered his hand with hers, the same small, steadying gesture that seemed to have become instinctive between them, without either of them quite deciding to allow it. "Then let me decide for myself what I'm willing to risk," she said. "Don't make that choice for me by pushing me away." Dante studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful, guarded eyes, before he finally nodded, just once, an unspoken agreement passing quietly between them, in the dim light of the small back office. Neither of them could have known, sitting there together in that fragile, uncertain moment, exactly how quickly Costa would move to test the boundaries Dante had just promised to defend, or how close that test would come to costing Clara everything. The black car appeared outside Clara's apartment building 2 weeks later, on a rainy Thursday evening, its headlights cutting through the dark just as she stepped out onto the sidewalk with her arms full of grocery bags. She noticed it slow beside her before she fully registered why it frightened her, the way a person notices danger a half-second before their mind catches up to name it. A man stepped out of the passenger side, someone she recognized vaguely from the edges of that tense meeting weeks earlier, one of Costa's men, and he said her name in a voice far too calm for the situation, the practiced calm of someone who had done this exact thing many times before. He told her, switching easily into English, that Mr. Costa would like a private conversation with her, somewhere quiet, somewhere she could explain everything she'd overheard during her weeks working closely alongside Dante Marchetti. Clara's grocery bags hit the wet pavement before she even decided to drop them. She turned to run, but the man was faster, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hand closing around her upper arm hard enough to make her gasp. What saved her that night wasn't luck. It was Dante's quiet insistence, days earlier, that Salvo shadow her movements discreetly whenever she left the restaurant alone. A precaution Clara had privately considered excessive at the time, and had only agreed to because arguing with Dante about her own safety had become, by that point, an argument she never seemed to win. Salvo emerged from a parked car half a block away before Costa's man could force Clara toward the waiting sedan, and what followed happened fast. A brief, ugly struggle on the wet pavement that ended within a minute, the sedan's tires screeching as it fled into the rain-soaked street, leaving its associate behind, subdued and furious, but unable to stop Salvo from pulling Clara safely away from him. She sat on the curb afterward, shaking uncontrollably, while Salvo called Dante and spoke rapidly in Sicilian, his voice tight with an urgency Clara had never heard from the normally unshakable driver before. Within 20 minutes, Dante himself arrived, moving faster than Clara had ever seen him move, his usual careful composure completely, visibly gone. He knelt in front of her on the wet pavement, his hands gripping her shoulders, checking her over with an urgency that had nothing to do with business at all, and everything to do with something he clearly hadn't yet said out loud to her directly. "I'm fine," Clara managed, though her voice shook badly as she said it. "I'm fine, Dante." "You're not fine," he said, his own voice unsteady, in a way that frightened her almost as much as the attack itself had. "You could have been taken tonight because of me. Because of what I offered you. Because I let myself believe I could keep you safe simply by wanting to. I could have been taken tonight because Costa is a coward who goes after ordinary people instead of the man he actually wants to confront directly," Clara said, and despite everything, despite the fear still coursing violently through her, some fierce, stubborn part of her refused to let Dante shoulder all the blame alone. He brought her back to his own home that night, rather than her apartment, a decision made quickly in the tense minutes following the attack, without much discussion between them. Clara didn't argue. The thought of returning to her own apartment alone, with Costa's people now knowing exactly where she lived, settled something cold and permanent in her chest that she didn't think would thaw anytime soon. Dante's house surprised her when they finally arrived, quieter and more understated than she had expected from a man who controlled so much of the city's docklands, more like the home of someone who valued privacy over display. He showed her to a guest room without hesitation, brought her tea she hadn't asked for, but drank gratefully anyway, and sat with her at his kitchen table long after midnight while she slowly processed everything that had happened, the adrenaline finally beginning to drain out of her in exhausted waves. "I should let you go," Dante said quietly at one point, staring down into his own untouched cup of tea. "Give you enough money to leave the city completely, start somewhere new, somewhere Costa's people would never think to look for you. That would be the responsible thing to do." "Is that what you actually want?" Clara asked. Dante looked up at her then, and for the first time since she'd met him, his carefully maintained control seemed to fail him entirely, something raw and unguarded showing through in his expression. "No," he admitted quietly. "That's the entire problem. I don't want you anywhere. I can't personally see you. I haven't wanted anything that badly in a very long time, not since before my father died, and I learned exactly what wanting things truly costs a man in this life." Clara reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the same small, steadying gesture that had become so familiar between them over the past weeks. "Then don't send me away," she said. "Let me stay. Let me help end this, instead of running from it for the rest of my life." Dante's fingers curled slowly around hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else at all, the silence between them heavier and far more honest than any conversation they'd shared in the weeks before it. The next morning, Dante called an early meeting with Teresa and Nico, and together, the three of them began sketching the outline of a plan, not simply to protect Clara from further attempts, like the one she'd survived the night before, but to end the threat from the Russo family permanently. A plan that would require every bit of Clara's fluency, her courage, and a willingness to walk directly back into danger, one final, decisive time. Teresa laid out what she'd uncovered during quiet research over the past several weeks, details she hadn't shared with anyone until now. 17 years earlier, when Dante's father had been killed outside a restaurant not unlike this one, the shooter had never been publicly identified. The case left cold by investigators who understood, without ever saying so directly, that certain deaths in this city were simply treated as the cost of doing business. Teresa's careful digging suggested the shooter had worked under Costa's own father, and that Costa himself had spent years quietly terrified the full truth would eventually surface and reignite a conflict his family could never hope to win outright. "If that's true," Dante said slowly, his voice tight with an old, controlled anger Clara hadn't heard from him before, "then everything Costa has done recently, chasing information, going after Clara directly, all of it traces back to protecting a secret he's been sitting on for 17 years. It fits," Teresa said. "It fits perfectly. He's not afraid of losing territory, Dante. He's afraid of what happens once you finally learn the truth about what his family actually did to ours." Clara listened to all of this with a growing, uneasy sense of her own role within it. She was fluent in exactly the language Costa's people used when they believed nobody outside their circle could understand them, which meant she was uniquely positioned to draw the confirmation they needed out into the open, if she was willing to face Costa directly one more time. "You don't have to be the one who does this," Dante said later that evening, once Teresa and Nico had left to begin arranging the details. He sat across from Clara in his quiet kitchen, his jaw tight with the visible effort of offering her an exit he clearly didn't actually want her to take. "I can find another way to get what we need." "There isn't another way, and you already know that," Clara said gently. "Costa's people already tried to take me once. He isn't going to stop coming after me simply because I stay quiet and hope he loses interest eventually. I would rather finish this on our own terms, while we still have the advantage of surprise." Dante reached across the table and took her hand again, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles over her knuckles, a gesture that had become steady and familiar in the days since the attack, comforting in a way neither of them had bothered to fully name out loud yet. "If anything happens to you," he said quietly, "I don't think I would survive it. I need you to understand that completely before you agree to walk into a room with that man again." "Nothing is going to happen to me," Clara said, holding his gaze steadily, "because you and Salvo are both going to be close enough to reach me the entire time." Over the following 2 days, Teresa worked carefully to arrange a meeting through channels that took considerable patience and even more discretion, brokering neutral ground on the far side of the river where Costa's family felt comfortable enough to speak freely. Clara spent those 2 days preparing in every way she could, memorizing exactly what questions might draw the confirmation they needed, rehearsing her own calm expression in the bathroom mirror until she was certain she could maintain it, even while her heart pounded wildly beneath the surface. On the morning of the meeting, Dante found her in the guest room, dressed carefully, a small transmitter already hidden beneath the collar of her blouse at Teresa's insistence. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching her, before crossing the room and taking both her hands in his. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly, "I want you to know that meeting you was the single unexpected thing to happen to me in 17 years. I don't regret a single moment of it, no matter how dangerous it's become." "Neither do I," Clara said, and meant every word of it completely, despite the fear still tightening steadily in her chest, with every passing minute that brought her closer to walking, alone, directly into the middle of the danger they had both been trying so carefully to survive. Downstairs, Teresa was waiting with a folder of notes she had assembled over the past 2 days, small details meant to help Clara steer the conversation without ever appearing to steer it at all. She walked Clara through the layout of the restaurant where the meeting would take place, the exits, the likely seating arrangement, the specific phrases in Sicilian that tended to signal when Costa was growing comfortable enough to speak carelessly. "He likes to feel clever," Teresa explained, sitting across from Clara at the kitchen table, with the folder open between them. "Men like Costa reveal the most when they believe they're the only one in the room who understands what's actually being said. Let him think that. Let him believe he's recruiting you, not confessing to you." "And if he doesn't take the bait?" Clara asked. "Then you leave," Teresa said firmly. "No hesitation, no second attempt." Salvo will be positioned outside within 30 seconds of any signal from your transmitter. Dante will be close enough to reach the door himself if something goes wrong. You are not walking into that room unprotected, Clara, whatever it might feel like once you're sitting across from him. Nico arrived shortly after, to go over the timing once more, insisting on walking Clara through the exact route she would take from the car to the restaurant entrance, and back out again once the meeting concluded. He was quieter than usual, his normally easy manner replaced by a focused seriousness that told Clara, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how much this plan mattered to the people who had so quickly, unexpectedly, become something like family to her. You didn't have to get this involved, Clara told him quietly, while Teresa stepped out to take a call. This isn't your fight. Anything that threatens Dante is my fight, Nico said simply. He's the only family I've had since I was 12 years old. And you, he added, glancing at her with something unexpectedly warm in his expression, you've become important to him faster than anyone I've ever seen. That makes you important to the rest of us too. Clara didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded, grateful in a way she couldn't fully put into words for how completely this family had absorbed her into its protection, even knowing every risk that came attached to it. By the time evening arrived, the plan had been rehearsed so many times that Clara could recite each step in her sleep. She dressed carefully in the guest room, choosing something simple and unremarkable, nothing that would draw unnecessary attention. Teresa helped her secure the small transmitter beneath the collar of her blouse, her fingers steady and practiced. Though her eyes carried a flicker of worry, she didn't bother fully hiding. Remember, Teresa said, stepping back to look Clara over one final time, you are not there to accuse him of anything. You are there to let him talk, and to ask exactly the questions we practiced, nothing more. Let his own pride do the rest of the work for you. I understand, Clara said. I know you do, Teresa said, and for just a moment, something almost gentle passed across her usually guarded expression. You've surprised all of us these past weeks, Clara. Don't stop now. Downstairs, Dante was waiting by the front door, dressed in the same dark, careful way he always dressed, though tonight there was a tension in his shoulders that no tailored suit could fully disguise. He watched Clara descend the staircase slowly, and something in his face softened even as the rest of him remained tightly wound with worry. Salvo will drive you, he said. I'll be 2 streets away, close enough to reach you within 90 seconds if anything goes wrong. Nico will cover the back entrance. Teresa will monitor the transmitter from the car with me. He paused, reaching out to gently straighten the collar of her blouse, his fingers lingering there a moment longer than the small adjustment required. I've gone over this plan 100 times looking for a way to keep you out of that room entirely. I couldn't find one. Because there isn't one, Clara said softly. This has to be me, Dante. You know that as well as I do. He nodded slowly, though the reluctance in his expression didn't fully fade. Just remember, he said, the moment anything feels wrong, anything at all, you say the word we agreed on, and I will be through that door before you finish the sentence. I remember, Clara said. He studied her for one more long moment, as though memorizing the sight of her standing there in his front hallway, brave and frightened, and utterly determined all at once, before finally stepping back to let Salvo lead her out to the waiting car. The drive across the river passed in near silence, Clara staring out the window at the passing streetlights, running through every rehearsed question one final time, while beside her, Salvo kept his eyes fixed steadily on the road, offering occasional quiet reassurances that did little to calm the steady drumbeat of her own pulse. By the time the car pulled up outside the restaurant Costa's family favored, dimly lit and quiet compared to the warm, bustling energy of Dante's own establishment across the river, Clara had settled into the same calm, careful composure she had practiced for 2 full days, burying her fear somewhere deep enough that it wouldn't show on her face, no matter how loudly it continued to pound beneath the surface. She stepped out of the car alone, exactly as the plan required, and walked toward the entrance without looking back, though she could feel, even without turning around, the weight of Dante's eyes following her every step of the way, watching over her from a careful distance, ready to close that distance instantly, the moment she needed him to. Costa was already seated when Clara walked inside, at a corner table near the back, dressed in the same easy, unhurried confidence she remembered from their brief encounter at the bar weeks earlier. He rose slightly when he saw her, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him, his smile warm and welcoming in a way that made Clara's skin crawl beneath her carefully maintained calm. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," he said, in English, once she'd taken her seat. "Given how our last conversation ended." "I'm here now," Clara said simply, folding her hands on the table in front of her, keeping her voice light, unbothered, exactly the way Teresa had coached her. Costa ordered wine for both of them without asking, and for the first 20 minutes, the conversation stayed exactly where Clara expected it to, careful and circling, Costa testing gently to see how much she actually knew, and how willing she might be to trade whatever she knew for something he was prepared to offer her in return. He spoke of opportunity, of a life far more comfortable than anything Dante could offer her, of protection for her mother that extended well beyond medical bills, dangling each promise carefully in front of her like bait he expected her to eventually snap at. Clara listened patiently, nodding at the right moments, letting a small, uncertain hesitation show in her expression exactly where Teresa had suggested it would be most convincing, allowing Costa to believe he was slowly winning her over. Then, exactly as Teresa had predicted, Costa's confidence finally got the better of him. He shifted into Sicilian, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping into something more relaxed, more genuine, believing the change in language would let him speak more freely, more honestly, certain that Clara's fluency made her someone he could recruit rather than a threat he needed to fear. He told her, in low, careless words, meant only for her ears, that his own father had ordered Dante's father's death 17 years earlier, over a shipment dispute that had spiraled far beyond anyone's original intentions. He told her he had spent his entire adult life terrified that Dante would eventually uncover the full truth and come for the Russo family with everything at his disposal, and that this fear, more than any territorial ambition, was the true reason he had been pushing so hard to control exactly what Clara knew and who she might eventually tell it to. Clara kept her face perfectly calm, the way she'd practiced endlessly the night before, and asked one final, carefully worded question, gently confirming the specific details clearly enough for the hidden transmitter to catch every single word without any room left for doubt or misinterpretation later. Costa answered her fully, satisfied, certain he had just secured her cooperation completely. He had, instead, just delivered a full and complete confession, spoken freely in a language he had always trusted to keep him safe from exactly this kind of exposure. Clara felt something settle inside her chest, a strange mixture of relief and dread, knowing she had exactly what she came for, and knowing, at the very same moment, that the most dangerous part of the evening might still lie directly ahead of her, sitting alone across the table from a man who had just revealed, without realizing it, the darkest secret of his entire family's history. She excused herself carefully a few minutes later, citing an early morning shift, and Costa let her go without suspicion, still smiling, still believing he had successfully begun turning her toward his side. Clara walked out of the restaurant at a steady, unhurried pace, resisting every instinct urging her to run, her heart pounding louder with every step, until she finally reached the sidewalk outside and saw Dante's car waiting exactly where it was supposed to be. Dante was out of the car before she'd even finished crossing the street, his face pale beneath the streetlights, his composure completely undone, in a way Clara had never witnessed from him before. He pulled her into his arms the moment she reached him, holding her tightly, his whole body shaking slightly with the effort of having listened to every single word through the earpiece Teresa had rigged for him, the truth about his father's death finally, after 17 long years, sitting cold and confirmed in his chest. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough against her hair. "Thank you for giving me the truth, for staying when every reasonable instinct told you to run from all of this weeks ago. What happens now?" Clara asked, pulling back just enough to look up at him. Dante's expression had shifted into something resolved and dangerous, entirely certain of itself. "Now," he said, "I make sure Costa never threatens you, or anyone else I care about, ever again." They drove back across the river in silence, Clara, leaning against Dante's shoulder, exhausted in a way that reached all the way down to her bones, while beside them, Teresa reviewed the recording on a small device, confirming every word had transmitted clearly enough to be used exactly as they needed it. Back at Dante's house, Nico was already waiting, along with two other men Clara recognized only vaguely from around the restaurant, and the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted quickly from relief into careful, focused planning. Dante didn't want revenge carried out in anger, Teresa reminded everyone firmly, gesturing toward Clara, as evidence that patience and precision had already delivered something far more valuable than any hasty, emotional reaction ever could. "We take this to the other families," Teresa said. "All of them. Let them hear exactly what Costa confessed to, in his own voice, in the language he trusted to protect him. Once they understand what his family did, and how long he spent covering it up, the Russo alliance will collapse on its own. Nobody protects a man who breaks the old rules and lies about it for 17 years. Dante listened carefully, his jaw tight, clearly fighting against every instinct, urging him toward something faster and far more violent. Finally, he nodded slowly, trusting his sister's judgment over his own anger, though Clara could see exactly how much restraint that decision cost him. "We do it your way," he said quietly. "Slowly, completely, so there's nothing left for Costa to rebuild from once it's finished." Over the following days, Teresa worked carefully to arrange a meeting of the city's other family leaders, quietly reaching out through channels she had spent years cultivating for exactly this kind of moment. Clara stayed close to the family throughout, no longer just the hostess who understood too much, no longer even simply the translator brought in from the outer edges of Dante's world, but something closer to a true partner now, present in the rooms where the most important decisions were being carefully made, her opinion genuinely sought rather than merely tolerated out of politeness. She found herself, during one quiet evening while Dante reviewed final details with Nico in the next room, sitting alone with Teresa in the kitchen, both of them nursing cups of tea that had long since gone cold. "You've changed something in him," Teresa said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I haven't seen my brother this certain of anything, this willing to trust someone completely outside our own blood, since before our father died. Whatever happens with Costa, I want you to know that." "I didn't set out to change anything," Clara said honestly. "I just wanted to survive long enough to keep my job and pay my mother's medical bills." Teresa smiled faintly, an expression rare enough on her usually composed face that Clara noticed it immediately. "Most important things happen exactly that way," she said. "Nobody plans on falling into the middle of a family's entire history. It simply happens, and then you decide what to do once you're standing in the middle of it." Clara thought about that long after the conversation ended, lying awake later that night in the guest room that had slowly, without her quite noticing when it happened, begun to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like somewhere she genuinely belonged. Whatever came next, whatever the confrontation with Costa and the other families ultimately required of her, she understood clearly now that she wasn't simply surviving inside Dante Marchetti's dangerous world anymore. She had become part of it completely, and despite every reasonable fear that still lingered somewhere beneath the surface, she found she didn't regret a single step that had led her here. The morning after the meeting was arranged, Clara woke to find the house already full of quiet activity, Nico moving through the hallway with a stack of papers, two of the men from the night before speaking in low, focused tones near the front door, and Dante himself standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee he didn't appear to be drinking, lost somewhere deep in thought. She joined him quietly, not saying anything at first, simply standing beside him and looking out at the same gray morning light he seemed to be studying so intently. "You're thinking about your father," she said eventually, not really a question. "I think about him every day," Dante admitted. "But today especially, 17 years of not knowing, and now I finally do, and somehow that doesn't feel the way I always imagined it would." "How did you imagine it would feel?" Clara asked. "Like relief," Dante said, "like something finally settling. Instead, it just feels like grief again, fresh, as if I only found out yesterday that he was gone at all." He turned to look at her, his expression softer than she'd seen it in days. "You gave me that truth, Clara. I don't know how to thank someone for something that heavy." "You don't have to thank me," Clara said. "Just let me stay close while you carry it." He reached for her hand, and they stood together at the window in silence for a long while, the ordinary sounds of the house continuing around them, until Teresa's voice finally called them both into the other room to review the final arrangements for the meeting ahead. The gathering of family leaders took place 3 days later, in a large private room above a restaurant Clara had never visited before, neutral ground chosen carefully by representatives from every side involved. Clara wasn't required to attend this part, Dante had insisted firmly, wanting to keep her as far from Costa's immediate reach as possible, until his fate had been fully decided by the people whose judgment carried the most weight in this world. She waited instead at Dante's house with Teresa, both of them sitting together in tense, quiet anticipation, while Nico kept them updated through brief, clipped phone calls throughout the long afternoon. The recording was played in full, Nico reported at one point, and the room had gone completely silent afterward. Several of the older leaders, visibly shaken by what they'd heard, confirmed in Costa's own voice. By evening, word finally came that the meeting had concluded. Costa's allies had abandoned him almost entirely once the recording finished playing, unwilling to continue protecting a man who had broken the oldest, most sacred rule between the families, and then spent 17 years lying about it to cover his own father's crime. Dante had not demanded blood, Nico explained, when he finally returned to the house late that night, exhausted but visibly lighter than Clara had seen him in weeks. He had demanded something that mattered more to a man like Costa instead: complete surrender of Russo territory, a full public acknowledgement of the truth in front of every family present, and permanent exile from the city that had built and then ultimately destroyed him. "It's more mercy than Costa ever deserved," Teresa said quietly, once Nico finished recounting the details. "But it's also exactly the kind of restraint that will earn Dante more respect across this city than any act of revenge ever could have." Clara felt the tension that had been sitting in her chest for weeks finally begin to loosen, though it didn't disappear completely, not yet. Dante didn't return home until well past midnight, and when he finally walked through the door, something in his posture had changed entirely. The weight he had carried for 17 years, visibly, noticeably lifted from his shoulders for the first time since Clara had known him. He found her waiting in the kitchen and crossed the room without a word, pulling her into his arms and holding her there for a long, silent moment before finally speaking. "It's finished," he said quietly. "Costa is gone. The truth is known. My father can finally rest, and so, I think, can I." "And Costa's men, the ones who came after me?" Clara asked. "Dealt with, permanently and completely, as part of the terms," Dante said. "Nobody connected to what happened to you will ever come near this city again. I made certain of that personally, before anything else was agreed to." Clara felt something in her finally release as well, a fear she had been carrying quietly for weeks, without fully realizing its full weight until the moment it lifted. They stood together in the quiet kitchen for a long while after that, neither of them saying much, simply grateful to have survived something that could easily have ended so differently for either of them. Outside, the city continued exactly as it always did, indifferent to the fact that an old, dangerous secret had finally been settled, unaware of everything it had cost and everything it had ultimately given both of them in return. "What happens to us now?" Clara asked eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Dante pulled back just enough to look at her properly, something warm and certain settling into his expression, the careful guardedness she had first met months earlier, now almost entirely gone. "Now," he said, "I stop being afraid of what wanting something might cost me, and I start figuring out how to actually build a life around it instead." 3 weeks passed before Clara truly believed the danger had ended. She kept waiting for it, some part of her still bracing every time a car slowed near her building, every time an unfamiliar face lingered too long near the restaurant windows. But the weeks continued passing quietly, one after another, without incident, and slowly, carefully, Clara allowed herself to accept that Costa's exile and the collapse of his alliances had truly closed the chapter that had once threatened to consume her entire life. The restaurant itself had changed in small, noticeable ways since that night. Dante moved through it now, with a lightness Clara hadn't seen in him during those first tense weeks, when she'd only known him as a hostess, watching a dangerous, guarded stranger from across the dining room floor. He laughed more easily, she noticed, especially with Nico, the old teasing warmth between them returning gradually the way color returns to a room once heavy curtains are finally pulled back from the windows. Teresa, too, seemed different, softer in small ways that Clara suspected few people outside the family ever had the chance to witness. She began inviting Clara to Sunday dinners at her own apartment, insisting they were simply practical planning sessions for the business, though the meals stretched longer each week, filled with more laughter and fewer papers spread across the table than either of them probably intended. Clara's mother, once the medical debt was finally, completely cleared, asked fewer questions than Clara expected about the sudden change in her daughter's circumstances. Though she did meet Dante eventually, over a quiet dinner Clara had dreaded for days beforehand. Her mother studied him carefully throughout the entire meal, the way mothers study anyone claiming a place in their daughter's life. And afterward, once Dante had gone to bring the car around, she took Clara's hand and told her simply that she recognized something steady in his eyes, something she trusted, despite everything she'd heard whispered about his family's reputation around the neighborhood. "Your grandmother would have liked him," her mother said. "She always said the old language carried more truth in it than English ever could. If he speaks to you honestly in that language, Clara, then I think you can trust whatever he tells you in it." Clara thought about that often in the weeks that followed, the strange, winding path that had led her from a hostess stand where she'd first overheard a dangerous conversation she was never meant to understand, to standing now beside a man who had built an entire trust between them out of exactly the language she'd once been so afraid to reveal she knew. One evening, months after Costa's exile, Dante found her behind the host stand again, the very same spot where she had first almost dropped a tray of glasses, the night everything between them had quietly, irreversibly begun. The restaurant had closed for the evening, the last of the staff gone home, and the two of them stood together in the comfortable quiet that had become so familiar to both of them by now. "I keep thinking about that first night," Dante said, leaning against the counter beside her. "You almost dropped that tray, and I looked up, and some part of me already knew something about you was different, even though I couldn't have explained what, not yet." "I was terrified you'd figure out I understood every word," Clara admitted, smiling despite herself at the memory, how far away that fear felt now compared to everything they had built together since. "I did figure it out eventually," Dante said. "It simply took me longer than it should have to understand exactly what that meant for both of us." He reached for her hand, the same slow, careful gesture that had become so familiar over the many months since that first tense conversation in his office. And this time, when he spoke, it wasn't in English, nor in the careful, measured Sicilian he used for business matters, but in the soft, private dialect of his grandmother's village. Words meant only for her, an admission of everything he had once been too guarded to say plainly, even to himself. Clara answered him fluently, in that same gentle language, the language her own grandmother had passed down to her, without ever imagining it would one day save her life completely, and then, unexpectedly, lead her into the arms of a man she had never once expected to trust, let alone come to love as deeply as she now understood she did. Later that same evening, walking together through the quiet streets near the restaurant, Dante told her about a small piece of land his family had owned for generations near the coast, a place he hadn't visited since childhood, before his father's death had pulled him permanently into a life he'd never chosen for himself. "I want to take you there someday," he said. "Not as an escape from any of this, just because I want you to see where my grandmother's language actually came from, the place she used to describe to me the same way, I imagine, yours described it to you." "I'd like that," Clara said, and meant it completely, picturing for the first time in longer than she could remember, a future stretching out ahead of her that felt genuinely peaceful, rather than simply survived one careful day at a time. Over the months that followed, life settled into a new, steadier rhythm neither of them had fully believed possible during those early, dangerous weeks. Clara continued her work within the family's operation, though her role had shifted gradually, expanding beyond simple translation into something closer to a genuine partnership, her judgment sought and trusted in rooms where, not so long ago, she had only been permitted to sit quietly in the corner. Teresa remained a steady, watchful presence in her life, the closest thing to a sister Clara had ever had, and Nico's teasing warmth had grown into a genuine, easy friendship that Clara treasured more than she ever expected to when she'd first taken a hostess job simply to cover her mother's medical bills. And Dante, the careful, guarded man who had once calmly discussed making a stranger disappear over an espresso, the same man Clara had once feared more than anyone else in her life, had become instead the person she trusted most completely in the entire world, someone whose careful control had softened, not disappeared, into something warmer and steadier, once he finally allowed himself to want something, without immediately fearing what it might cost him. On a warm evening, nearly a year after that first overheard conversation, Dante took Clara to the small stretch of coastline his family had owned for generations, exactly as he had promised her he would. They sat together on the rocky shore as the sun set slowly over the water, and Dante spoke to her again in that same soft, private dialect, words that needed no translation between them anymore, because Clara understood every single one of them completely, in every language that mattered. She had come to Marchetti's looking for nothing more than a paycheck to cover her mother's medical bills. She had found, instead, a family, a purpose, and a man who no longer needed to hide anything from her at all, because she had proven to him, in the language he once believed only he and his own blood could truly speak, that some kinds of understanding run far deeper than words ever could, and some kinds of trust, once earned honestly, last far longer than any danger either of them had ever survived together.